What drives ordinary people to abandon everything they know and follow charismatic leaders into darkness? If you're fascinated by the psychology behind history's most notorious cults and want to understand how manipulation, control, and tragedy unfold in real time, you've found the right place. Hit that subscribe button right now because we're about to dive deep into stories that will challenge everything you think you know about human nature, religious freedom, and the dangerous power of blind faith. I'm Boring Nightmares, and this is where we explore the twisted minds and devastating consequences of the world's deadliest cults. Let's begin. Throughout history, humans have gathered in groups seeking purpose, meaning, and belonging. But what happens when that search for spiritual fulfillment takes a dark turn? When charismatic leaders exploit the deepest vulnerabilities of their followers, transforming sanctuaries into prisons and faith into fear. Today, we're diving into three of the most disturbing cults that operated under the guise of Christianity, organizations that used religious doctrine to justify unspeakable acts of control, abuse, and violence. These aren't the Hollywood versions of cults you see in movies. These are real organizations that destroyed real families, shattered real lives, and left scars that continue to haunt survivors decades later. We're talking about groups that convinced ordinary people to surrender their children, their bodies, their money, and ultimately their freedom to leaders who claimed to speak for God but acted like tyrants. The stories you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about religious communities in America. They reveal how easily the line between devotion and destruction can be crossed, how charismatic manipulation can override common sense, and how the promise of salvation can become a pathway to hell on earth. First, we have Tony Alamo Christian Ministries, where a convicted child molester used biblical prophecy to justify polygamy and abuse. Then there's the Remnant Fellowship, where weight loss became a twisted form of worship that led to the deaths of innocent children. Finally, we'll explore the Love Family, a hippie commune that transformed into an authoritarian nightmare, where members were stripped of their identities and forced to live as slaves to their leaders' every whim. What makes these groups particularly insidious is how they began. None of them started as obvious cults. They attracted followers through promises of spiritual enlightenment, community, and purpose. They offered answers to life's most difficult questions and provided a sense of belonging that many people desperately craved. But beneath the surface of prayer meetings and Bible studies, something far more sinister was taking root. Tony Alamo Christian Ministries emerged from the Jesus movement of the 1960s, initially appearing as just another evangelical church trying to reach the counterculture generation. Bernie Lazar Hoffman, who would later rename himself Tony Alamo, was a Jewish musician from Missouri who claimed to have found Christ and devoted his life to street preaching. Along with his wife Susan, he established a ministry that seemed focused on helping drug addicts and runaways find salvation. The early days of the ministry looked almost admirable from the outside. They operated soup kitchens, provided shelter for the homeless, and ran businesses that employed their members. Susan Alamo was particularly effective at drawing people in, presenting herself as a prophet who received direct revelations from God. She had a magnetic personality that made people feel special, chosen, and loved in a way they had never experienced before. But even in those early years, warning signs were present for those who knew how to look. Members were expected to turn over all their possessions to the ministry. They worked long hours in Alamo businesses without pay, being told that their labor was service to God. Personal relationships outside the group were discouraged, and members were gradually isolated from family and friends who might question their involvement. The control mechanisms were subtle at first. Members were encouraged to confess their sins publicly, creating detailed records of their most shameful moments that could later be used against them. They were taught that questioning Tony Alamo's authority was equivalent to questioning God himself. Sleep deprivation became normalized through marathon prayer sessions and work schedules that left people too exhausted to think critically. When Susan Alamo died of cancer in 1982, the ministry took a dramatically darker turn. Tony claimed that God would resurrect his wife, and her body was kept in a room at their Arkansas compound for months while members prayed for her return. When the resurrection never came, Tony's behavior became increasingly erratic and controlling. He began claiming that he was a prophet with special authority from God, and that's when the sexual abuse began in earnest. Alamo developed a twisted theology around polygamy, claiming that God had commanded him to take multiple wives to fulfill biblical prophecy. But these weren't adult women making informed choices. Many of his wives were children, some as young as 8 years old. He convinced their parents that giving their daughters to him was an act of faith that would guarantee their family's salvation. The abuse was systematic and horrific. Young girls were told that submitting to Alamo was submitting to God, and that resistance would damn their souls to hell. They were isolated from their families, homeschooled with curriculum that reinforced Alamo's authority, and subjected to psychological manipulation that convinced them they were privileged to be chosen by God's prophet. Meanwhile, the financial exploitation continued to grow. Members worked in Alamo's businesses for no wages, generating millions of dollars that funded his lavish lifestyle. He owned multiple properties, expensive cars, and lived in luxury, while his followers survived on minimal food and shelter. When members tried to leave, they were told they would be abandoning God and facing eternal damnation. The compound in Arkansas became a fortress-like environment where outsiders were viewed with suspicion and members were monitored constantly. Children were separated from their parents and raised communally, with their primary loyalty being to Tony Alamo rather than their biological families. Education was limited to religious indoctrination, ensuring that young people had no skills or knowledge that would help them survive in the outside world. Law enforcement struggled to investigate the ministry because of religious freedom protections and the isolated nature of the compounds. When officials did attempt to intervene, they were met with legal challenges and claims of religious persecution. Alamo was skilled at presenting himself as a victim of government oppression, rallying his followers to view any outside interference as an attack on their faith. The psychological control was perhaps the most devastating aspect of the organization. Members were taught that their thoughts and feelings couldn't be trusted, that only Tony Alamo could interpret God's will correctly. They were subjected to constant surveillance by other members, creating an atmosphere of paranoia where no one could be trusted. Critical thinking was discouraged through sleep deprivation, inadequate nutrition, and endless hours of religious programming. Children born into the ministry never knew any other way of life. They were raised to believe that the outside world was evil and that their survival depended on absolute obedience to Alamo's commands. Many had no legal documentation of their births, making it difficult for them to access services or prove their identities if they ever escaped. The financial structure of the ministry was designed to make leaving nearly impossible. Members had no personal assets, no work history that would be recognized by outside employers, and no social connections beyond the group. Even if they wanted to leave, they faced the prospect of starting over with absolutely nothing while being told that they were abandoning God and their eternal salvation. The sexual abuse wasn't limited to Alamo's so-called wives. The entire culture of the ministry normalized inappropriate relationships between adults and children. Young people were taught that their bodies belonged to God and that God's representatives had the right to use them however they saw fit. The line between spiritual authority and physical exploitation was deliberately blurred until members couldn't distinguish between the two. When former members began speaking out about the abuse, they faced a coordinated campaign of harassment and intimidation. Alamo's followers would show up at their homes, workplaces, and legal proceedings, attempting to silence them through fear and psychological pressure. Many survivors struggled with severe trauma, having been convinced that their abuse was somehow their fault or part of God's plan. The ministry's businesses served multiple purposes beyond generating income. They provided a way to exploit member labor while maintaining a veneer of legitimacy. The companies appeared to be normal enterprises, making it difficult for outsiders to recognize the coercive conditions under which the workers operated. Members were told that their unpaid labor was building God's kingdom, while the profits funded Alamo's increasingly extravagant lifestyle. The legal system proved inadequate for addressing the complex web of abuse and exploitation that characterized the ministry. Traditional criminal law wasn't designed to handle organizations that combined financial fraud, child abuse, forced labor, and psychological manipulation under the protection of religious freedom. Moving from Tony Alamo's perverse interpretation of Christianity, we now turn to another cult that masqueraded as a religious organization while inflicting devastating harm on its members. The Remnant Fellowship, founded by Gwen Shamblin Lara in 1999, began as what appeared to be a Christian weight loss ministry, but evolved into a controlling cult that destroyed families and claimed multiple lives through its extreme practices. Gwen Shamblin's journey from diet guru to cult leader started in the 1980s when she developed the Way Down Workshop, a Christian-based weight loss program that combined biblical teachings with dietary restrictions. Shamblin, a registered dietitian with a master's degree in food and nutrition, initially gained credibility through her professional credentials and charismatic presentation style. Her program attracted thousands of participants who were drawn to the promise of losing weight while growing closer to God. The Way Down Workshop taught that overeating was a sin and that true hunger should be the only motivation for eating. Participants were instructed to pray before meals, eat only when genuinely hungry, and stop eating the moment they felt satisfied. While this approach might seem reasonable on the surface, it was underpinned by Shamblin's belief that physical appearance directly reflected spiritual devotion. She taught that thin people were more righteous and closer to God, while overweight individuals were spiritually deficient and disobedient. As Shamblin's influence grew, so did her theological claims. She began asserting that mainstream Christianity had corrupted the true message of Jesus Christ, and that she had been chosen by God to restore authentic biblical teachings. In 1999, she officially founded the Remnant Fellowship Church in Brentwood, Tennessee, positioning herself as the sole interpreter of divine truth. The church's name reflected Shamblin's belief that only a small remnant of true believers would be saved, and that she was leading this chosen group. The transition from diet program to religious cult was gradual but deliberate. Shamblin used her existing network of Way Down workshop participants as a recruitment pool for the church. She portrayed the Remnant Fellowship as the natural progression for those who were serious about their spiritual journey. Many participants, already emotionally invested in Shamblin's teachings and having experienced initial weight loss success, were vulnerable to this escalation. Central to the Remnant Fellowship's doctrine was the concept of absolute submission to authority. Shamblin taught that questioning leadership was equivalent to questioning God himself. Members were expected to demonstrate complete obedience to church leaders, with Shamblin at the apex of this hierarchy. This principle extended beyond spiritual matters into every aspect of members' lives, including career choices, financial decisions, and family relationships. The church's approach to child discipline was particularly disturbing and would later become a focal point of criminal investigations. Shamblin and other leaders promoted severe physical punishment for children, claiming that harsh discipline was not only biblical but necessary for salvation. Parents were taught that failing to adequately punish their children was a form of child abuse that would result in the child's spiritual damnation. Church literature and audio recordings revealed the extent of these teachings. Leaders recommended using implements like glue sticks and belts to strike children, sometimes for infractions as minor as not sitting still during church services or failing to complete tasks quickly enough. The punishment was to be administered with a calm demeanor, as showing emotion during discipline was considered inappropriate. Children were expected to remain silent during beatings and to thank their parents afterward. These extreme disciplinary practices created an atmosphere of fear and control within member families. Children lived in constant anxiety, never knowing when they might face punishment. Parents, convinced that their children's eternal souls were at stake, felt compelled to comply with increasingly harsh demands from church leadership. The normal parent-child bond was systematically undermined as parents were taught to prioritize church teachings over their natural protective instincts. The Remnant Fellowship also exercised significant control over members' finances. Followers were expected to tithe substantial portions of their income to the church, often 20% or more of their earnings. Shamblin taught that financial sacrifice was a demonstration of faith and that God would bless generous givers with prosperity. Members who struggled financially were told that their poverty was a result of insufficient faith or hidden sin. The church operated several businesses, including restaurants and construction companies that primarily employed members. These enterprises served multiple purposes. They generated revenue for the organization, provided employment that kept members within the church's sphere of influence, and created additional opportunities for control and surveillance. Employees were expected to work long hours for below-market wages, with any complaints dismissed as evidence of poor spiritual attitude. Isolation from outside influences was another key element of the remnant fellowship's control strategy. Members were discouraged from maintaining relationships with family and friends who were not part of the church. Shamblin taught that non-believers, including family members, could be spiritually dangerous and might lead the faithful astray. This isolation made it increasingly difficult for members to maintain perspective on the group's practices or to seek help when problems arose. The church also controlled access to information, discouraging members from consuming secular media or engaging with outside sources of news and entertainment. Television, movies, and books were heavily restricted, with only church-approved materials considered appropriate. This information control helped maintain the group's narrative and prevented members from exposure to contrary viewpoints that might challenge their beliefs. Education was another area where the church exerted influence. Many members homeschooled their children using curricula approved by church leadership. The education focused heavily on religious indoctrination while providing minimal exposure to critical thinking skills or secular knowledge. Children were taught that questioning authority figures was sinful and that absolute obedience was a virtue. The remnant fellowship's extreme practices began attracting attention from child welfare authorities in the early 2000s. Several families associated with the church were investigated for child abuse, leading to some children being removed from their homes. However, the church's legal resources and the challenges of prosecuting religiously motivated abuse cases meant that many investigations were unsuccessful in bringing about meaningful change. The most tragic consequence of the church's teachings came in 2003 with the death of 8-year-old Joseph Smith. Joseph's parents, Sonia and Joseph Smith, were members of the Remnant Fellowship who had embraced the church's harsh disciplinary practices. When Joseph failed to lose weight as demanded by church leaders, his parents subjected him to increasingly severe restrictions and punishments. The details of Joseph's final days revealed the horrific extent of the abuse he endured. He was denied food for extended periods, forced to exercise excessively, and beaten repeatedly with various implements. Church leaders, including Shamblin herself, were aware of the situation and had provided guidance on how to handle the rebellious child. When Joseph finally collapsed and died, his parents initially tried to hide the evidence of abuse before calling for medical help. The subsequent investigation and trial exposed the Remnant Fellowship's role in Joseph's death. Evidence presented in court included audio recordings of church meetings where leaders discussed disciplinary strategies and emails detailing the abuse Joseph endured. Despite the clear connection between church teachings and the child's death, many members remained loyal to Shamblin and the organization. Joseph's parents were eventually convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. However, the broader accountability for the church's role in promoting the abusive practices remained limited. Shamblin and other leaders claimed that the parents had misinterpreted the church's teachings and that the organization was not responsible for their actions. The negative publicity surrounding Joseph's death did impact the Remnant Fellowship's growth and public image. Some members left the organization and recruitment became more challenging. However, The core group of followers remained committed to Shamblin's leadership, viewing the outside criticism as persecution that validated their status as the chosen remnant. Throughout this period, Shamblin continued to live an increasingly lavish lifestyle funded by her followers' contributions. She resided in a multi-million-dollar mansion, wore expensive jewelry, and maintained an elaborate wardrobe. Her hair became increasingly voluminous and styled in a distinctive manner that became almost as famous as her teachings. This ostentation contrasted sharply with the financial sacrifices demanded of her followers. The Remnant Fellowship also began incorporating elements of Hebrew roots theology, which emphasized the importance of following Old Testament laws and practices. This shift provided additional justification for the group's harsh disciplinary practices and helped differentiate it further from mainstream Christianity. Shamblin claimed that most Christian churches had abandoned God's true requirements and that only the Remnant Fellowship maintained authentic biblical standards. As the organization evolved, it developed an increasingly complex hierarchy with multiple levels of leadership and specialized roles for different members. Those in leadership positions enjoyed privileges and authority over rank and file members, creating incentives for loyalty and competition for advancement. This structure also distributed responsibility for controversial decisions, making it more difficult to hold any single individual accountable for the organization's actions. The church's influence extended beyond its immediate membership through various outreach programs and media efforts. Shamblin continued to promote her weight loss materials and appeared on television programs to discuss her methods. These public appearances served both as recruitment tools and as ways to maintain the organization's financial support base. Former members who managed to leave the Remnant Fellowship faced significant challenges in rebuilding their lives. Many had sacrificed their careers, education, and relationships to commit to the church. The psychological impact of years of control and manipulation required extensive therapy and support. Some former members struggled with guilt and shame about their participation in the organization's harmful practices, particularly those who had subjected their own children to abuse. The process of leaving was often complicated by the church's response to defections. Former members reported harassment, threats, and attempts to turn their remaining family members against them. The organization's resources allowed it to pursue legal action against critics and former members, creating additional barriers to those seeking to escape or speak out about their experiences. Despite these challenges, a network of former members and concerned family members began working to expose the Remnant Fellowship's practices and help others leave the organization. These efforts included sharing testimonies, providing support resources, and working with law enforcement and child protective services when abuse was suspected. The Remnant Fellowship's story illustrates how legitimate-seeming programs can serve as gateways to more extreme forms of control and abuse. Shamblin's initial credibility as a registered dietitian and the seemingly reasonable goals of weight loss and spiritual growth provided cover for increasingly harmful practices. The gradual escalation of demands and the isolation of members made it difficult for participants to recognize the transformation of the organization. The case also demonstrates the challenges faced by authorities attempting to address religiously motivated abuse. The protection of religious freedom, while essential in a democratic society, can be exploited by those who use spiritual authority to justify harmful actions. The complexity of family dynamics within high control groups makes it particularly difficult to protect children who may be taught that outside intervention is persecution. The Remnant Fellowship's legacy is one of broken families, traumatized children, and lives destroyed in the name of spiritual purity. Now we turn to the third and perhaps most insidious organization on our list, the Love Family. Founded in 1968 by Paul Erdman, who renamed himself Love Israel, this cult emerged from the hippie counterculture movement in Seattle, Washington. Unlike the more overtly religious facades of Tony Alamo's ministry or Gwen Shamblin's weight loss program, the Love Family presented itself as a utopian commune dedicated to peace, love, and spiritual enlightenment. But beneath this veneer of 1960s idealism lay a carefully constructed system of psychological manipulation, financial exploitation, and devastating family destruction that would span nearly 3 decades. Paul Erdman was a charismatic former traveling salesman who possessed an uncanny ability to read people and tell them exactly what they wanted to hear. In the turbulent social climate of the late 1960s, with young Americans questioning traditional values and seeking alternative lifestyles, Erdman saw an opportunity. He began gathering followers in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood, preaching a message that blended Christianity with New Age spirituality, Eastern mysticism, and communal living principles. His timing was perfect. The Vietnam War raged on, civil rights tensions dominated headlines, and a generation of young people felt alienated from mainstream society. The Love Family's recruitment strategy was sophisticated and predatory. Members would frequent college campuses, coffee shops, and areas where young people congregated, looking for individuals who appeared lonely, confused, or searching for meaning. They would engage these potential recruits in seemingly innocent conversations about spirituality, philosophy, and the problems with modern society. The initial approach was never overtly religious or pushy. Instead, they would invite prospects to informal gatherings where they could meet like-minded people and explore alternative ways of living. What made the Love Family particularly dangerous was their gradual indoctrination process. New members weren't immediately subjected to the cult's most extreme practices. Instead, they were welcomed into what appeared to be a loving, supportive community where everyone shared resources and worked together for the common good. The early stages felt liberating to many young people who had grown up in strict religious households or felt suffocated by conventional expectations. Here was a place where they could experiment with different ideas, live communally, and feel part of something larger than themselves. But the transformation was insidious. Once individuals became emotionally invested in the community, the rules began to change. Love Israel instituted a system where all members had to surrender their birth names and take new names that reflected their spiritual rebirth. This wasn't presented as a demand, but as a joyful celebration of their new identity. Members became Love Joy, Love Peace, Love Light, and so forth. The practice served a darker purpose. It began the process of erasing their previous identities and creating psychological distance from their former lives. The financial exploitation started gradually as well. New members were encouraged to contribute what they could to the common good of the family. This began with small donations or helping with expenses, but eventually escalated to demands that members turn over their entire paychecks, savings accounts, and inheritances, and property to the group. Love Israel convinced followers that private ownership was selfish and that true spiritual enlightenment required complete detachment from material possessions. Members who worked outside the commune were required to hand over their entire paychecks to the leadership, receiving only small allowances for personal needs. The cult's control mechanisms became increasingly sophisticated over time. Love Israel established a complex hierarchy within the group, with himself at the top as the infallible spiritual leader, followed by a council of elders who enforced his directives. Members were assigned to different families within the larger Love family structure, with family heads responsible for monitoring behavior and reporting any signs of dissent or doubt. This created a surveillance system where members were constantly watched and evaluated by their peers. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Love family was their approach to relationships and sexuality. Love Israel claimed that traditional marriage was outdated and possessive, advocating instead for what he called spiritual unions that he would personally arrange and dissolve. He positioned himself as having divine authority over all romantic relationships within the group, deciding who could be together and for how long. This gave him tremendous power over members' most intimate connections and created a system where personal relationships were subject to his whims and control. The cult's treatment of children was particularly horrifying. Children born into or brought into the Love family were considered property of the entire group rather than belonging to their biological parents. Love Israel taught that individual parent-child bonds were selfish and interfered with the child's spiritual development. Children were often separated from their parents and raised communally, with biological parents having limited say in their upbringing, education, or medical care. This separation was presented as being in the children's best interests, allowing them to develop without the negative influences of possessive parental love. Education within the Love family was severely restricted and controlled. Children received minimal formal schooling, with the cult's leadership arguing that traditional education filled young minds with worldly corruption and materialistic values. Instead, children were taught basic literacy and numeracy skills alongside heavy indoctrination in the group's spiritual beliefs. This educational neglect left many children who eventually escaped the cult severely disadvantaged and struggling to integrate into mainstream society. The cult's isolation tactics were comprehensive and ruthless. Members were gradually encouraged to cut ties with family and friends outside the group, with Love Israel teaching that these relationships were spiritually harmful and held members back from achieving enlightenment. Phone calls and visits with outsiders were initially discouraged, then restricted, and eventually forbidden entirely. Mail was intercepted and censored, with letters from concerned family members often destroyed before members could see them. This isolation made it extremely difficult for members to maintain perspective on their situation or receive reality checks from people outside the cult's influence. Love Israel's control over information was absolute. Members were forbidden from reading newspapers, watching television, or consuming any media that wasn't approved by the leadership. The cult leader taught that outside information was spiritually polluting and would interfere with members' spiritual growth. This information control created a bubble where members only received filtered information that supported the cult's worldview and love Israel's authority. When major world events occurred, members might not learn about them for weeks or months, and then only through the cult's distorted interpretation. The psychological manipulation employed by the Love family was sophisticated and multifaceted. Love Israel used a combination of sleep deprivation, nutritional deficiencies, constant work demands, and emotional manipulation to keep members in a state of psychological vulnerability. Members were expected to work long hours for the cult's various business enterprises while surviving on minimal sleep and often inadequate nutrition. This physical exhaustion made it difficult for individuals to think clearly or question what was happening to them. The cult's punishment system was designed to break down individual resistance and enforce absolute compliance. Members who questioned Love Israel's authority or expressed doubts about the group's practices faced public humiliation, isolation, and sometimes physical punishment. These sessions, called family meetings, involved the entire community gathering to criticize and condemn the wayward member until they confessed their errors and pledged renewed devotion to Love Israel and the family's teachings. The psychological pressure of facing condemnation from everyone they considered family was devastating and highly effective at suppressing dissent. One of the most tragic aspects of the Love family was how they exploited people's genuine spiritual seeking and desire for community. Many members had joined because they were sincerely looking for meaning, purpose, and connection in their lives. The cult took these noble aspirations and twisted them into tools of control and exploitation. Members' spiritual hunger was fed with a steady diet of pseudo-mystical teachings that sounded profound but ultimately served to justify Love Israel's absolute authority and the group's increasingly extreme practices. The Love family's business operations were extensive and lucrative, generating significant income that flowed directly to Love Israel and his inner circle while members lived in poverty. The cult operated restaurants, construction companies, janitorial services, and various other enterprises using essentially free labor from their members. These businesses were often quite successful because they could undercut competitors by using unpaid cult labor, but the profits were never shared with the workers who generated them. Instead, Love Israel lived lavishly while his followers scraped by on minimal resources. The cult's relationship with law enforcement and social services was complex and often frustrating for families trying to rescue their loved ones. Because the Love family maintained a facade of being a legitimate religious organization, and because their adult members appeared to be participating voluntarily, authorities were limited in what actions they could take. The cult was careful to avoid overtly illegal activities that would draw unwanted attention, instead operating in gray areas where their practices were unethical and harmful, but not necessarily criminal. Former members who eventually escaped the Love family described a process of gradual awakening that was often triggered by witnessing particularly egregious abuse or by brief contact with the outside world that reminded them of what they had lost. The process of leaving was extraordinarily difficult, as members had to overcome years of psychological conditioning, face the prospect of starting over with no resources or job skills, and often had to abandon children or other family members who remained trapped in the cult. The aftermath for survivors was devastating and long-lasting. Many struggled with severe depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder as they tried to rebuild their lives. Those who had been in the cult for many years found themselves ill-equipped to function in mainstream society, lacking basic life skills, job experience, and social connections. Parents who had lost children to the cult faced the additional trauma of trying to reconnect with offspring who had been taught to view them as spiritual enemies. The Love family's impact on the broader Seattle community was significant but often overlooked. Hundreds of families lost sons, daughters, parents, and siblings to the cult over its nearly 3-decade existence. The ripple effects of this loss extended through generations, with grandparents cut off from grandchildren, siblings separated for decades, and family relationships permanently fractured by the cult's divisive influence. What makes the Love family's story particularly relevant today is how their recruitment and control tactics have been adapted and refined by modern cult-like organizations. The use of social media, online communities, and digital manipulation has made it easier than ever for predatory groups to identify vulnerable individuals and gradually draw them into systems of control and exploitation. The basic psychological principles that Love Israel exploited, human needs for belonging, purpose, and spiritual meaning, remain unchanged, making people just as susceptible to similar manipulation today. The legal and social challenges posed by groups like the Love family continue to perplex authorities and families dealing with cult involvement. The balance between protecting religious freedom and preventing exploitation remains delicate and controversial. While society has become more aware of cult tactics and warning signs, the fundamental problems of how to help people trapped in these organizations and how to prevent their formation in the first place remain largely unsolved. The story of the Love family serves as a stark reminder that the most dangerous predators often come disguised as saviors, offering exactly what vulnerable people most desperately need: love, acceptance, purpose, and community. By understanding how these organizations operate, how they exploit fundamental human needs, and how they maintain control over their victims, we can better protect ourselves and our loved ones from falling prey to similar manipulation. What makes these cults particularly insidious is how they exploited fundamental human psychological needs: the need for belonging, for purpose, for community, for spiritual meaning. They didn't target the weak or the foolish. They targeted normal people during vulnerable moments in their lives, people who had lost jobs, who were struggling with addiction, who had experienced trauma or loss, who were searching for something deeper than what mainstream society offered. The recruitment process was remarkably similar across all three organizations. It began with what psychologists call love bombing. New members were showered with attention, affection, and acceptance. They were told they were special, chosen, that they had found their true family. This phase could last weeks or months, just long enough for the person to become emotionally invested and to begin severing ties with their outside support network. Once the initial honeymoon period ended, the control mechanisms would gradually intensify. Information control became paramount. Members were discouraged from reading outside materials, watching television, or maintaining relationships with non-believers. In Tony Alamo's organization, Members were required to turn over all personal possessions, including identification documents and any money they had. This created complete financial dependence on the group. The remnant fellowship employed a more sophisticated approach to information control. Rather than banning outside media entirely, they taught members to interpret everything through the lens of Gwen Shamblin's teachings. News events, family problems, even personal feelings were all filtered through the group's ideology. Members learned to distrust their own judgment and to seek approval from leadership for even minor decisions. Sleep deprivation was another common control mechanism. In the Love family, members were kept on irregular schedules with frequent late-night meetings and early morning work assignments. This chronic exhaustion made critical thinking nearly impossible and increased susceptibility to the group's messaging. Similar patterns emerged in the other organizations, where members reported being constantly busy with group activities, leaving no time for reflection or outside relationships. The financial exploitation was systematic and devastating. Tony Alamo's followers were required to turn over their paychecks, Social Security benefits, and any other income to the ministry. Many were forced to work in businesses owned by the organization for little or no pay. When members tried to leave, they found themselves with no money, no credit, and often no legal identification since these documents had been confiscated. Children born into these groups faced particularly horrific circumstances. In all three organizations, normal child development was severely disrupted. Education was limited to religious indoctrination. Children were separated from their parents and raised communally, making it easier for leadership to control and abuse them. The psychological damage from growing up in these environments often persisted for decades after escape. The sexual abuse that occurred in these groups was endemic and systematic. Leaders used their claimed divine authority to justify exploitation of both adult and child members. In Tony Alamo's organization, polygamy was not only practiced, but mandated, with young girls forced into marriages with older men. The psychological manipulation was so complete that many victims defended their abusers even after escaping the group. Physical violence was another tool of control, though it was often disguised as discipline or spiritual purification. The Remnant Fellowship's emphasis on child discipline led to at least one documented death and countless cases of severe abuse. Members were taught that questioning these practices was a sign of spiritual weakness or demonic influence. The groups also employed sophisticated techniques to prevent members from leaving. Exit costs were made artificially high through financial dependence, social isolation, and psychological manipulation. Members who tried to leave were told they would face eternal damnation, that their families would be destroyed, that they would never find happiness in the outside world. Many were convinced that they were incapable of surviving without the group's support. Perhaps most disturbing was how these organizations used legitimate religious concepts to justify their abuse. Scripture was twisted and taken out of context to support the leader's authority and the group's practices. Members were taught that obedience to leadership was equivalent to obedience to God, making resistance feel like a sin. The psychological impact on survivors has been profound and lasting. Many struggle with post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety. Having been taught to distrust their own judgment and to rely completely on authority figures, Survivors often face difficulties making decisions and forming relationships in the outside world. The process of psychological recovery can take years or even decades. What makes these cases particularly tragic is how preventable they were. In each instance, there were warning signs that were ignored or dismissed. Family members tried to intervene, but were rebuffed by both the cult members and sometimes by law enforcement, who were reluctant to interfere with what appeared to be religious practices. The legal system's protection of religious freedom, while important, created loopholes that these predatory groups exploited. The financial costs to society have been enormous. Beyond the direct victims, these groups consumed vast resources from law enforcement, social services, and the court system. The investigation and prosecution of Tony Alamo alone cost taxpayers millions of dollars. The ongoing support needed by survivors, many of whom escaped with nothing and suffered severe psychological trauma, represents an additional burden on social services. These three organizations represent just a small fraction of the destructive groups that have operated in America. Experts estimate that hundreds of similar organizations exist at any given time, ranging from small local groups to international networks. The common thread is that exploitation of human vulnerability for the benefit of charismatic leaders who use religious or spiritual concepts as tools of manipulation and control. The digital age has created new opportunities for these groups to recruit and control members. Social media platforms allow them to target vulnerable individuals with precision, while online communication makes it easier to maintain control over geographically dispersed members. The challenge for law enforcement and mental health professionals has only grown more complex. Understanding these groups and their methods is crucial for prevention. By recognizing the warning signs and understanding the psychological mechanisms they employ, we can better protect ourselves and our communities from similar predators. The psychological aftermath of escaping these three cults reveals a pattern of trauma that extends far beyond the initial abuse. Survivors of the Tony Alamo Christian Ministries, the Remnant Fellowship, and the Love Family don't simply walk away and resume normal lives. The damage runs deeper than most people understand, affecting every aspect of their existence in ways that can persist for decades. The most insidious aspect of cult recovery is what psychologists call learned helplessness. After years of being told when to eat, when to sleep, who to marry, and how to think, survivors often find themselves paralyzed by the simplest decisions. Former members describe standing in grocery stores for hours, overwhelmed by the choice between different brands of cereal. The freedom they desperately wanted becomes a source of terror because they've forgotten how to exercise their own will. Identity reconstruction presents another massive challenge. Many survivors joined these groups as children or young adults, meaning they never developed a sense of self outside the cult environment. Sarah, who spent 15 years in Tony Alamo's organization, explains it this way: "I didn't know who I was without someone telling me who to be. I had to learn basic things like what foods I actually liked, what music I enjoyed, even what clothes felt comfortable on my body." The financial devastation compounds these psychological wounds. Survivors typically leave with nothing, having surrendered all their assets to the group. They often lack basic documents like social security cards or driver's licenses, making it nearly impossible to secure employment or housing. Many have no work history outside the cult, no credit history, and no savings. The practical challenges of rebuilding from absolute zero while dealing with severe trauma create a perfect storm of vulnerability. Perhaps most heartbreaking is the destruction of family relationships. Cults deliberately fracture natural family bonds, replacing them with loyalty to the group. Parents are turned against children, siblings against each other, and spouses against one another. When someone leaves, they often lose contact with family members who remain behind. The guilt and grief of leaving loved ones in danger wars with the knowledge that maintaining contact could pull them back into the abuse. The spiritual trauma requires special attention. These groups weaponized faith itself, turning religious concepts into tools of manipulation and control. Survivors often struggle with what researchers call religious trauma syndrome, experiencing panic attacks at the mention of God, fear of prayer, or complete rejection of any spiritual practice. The very thing that once provided meaning and comfort becomes a source of terror. Trust becomes almost impossible to rebuild. After years of being lied to, manipulated, and betrayed by people who claimed to love them, survivors often develop hypervigilance around new relationships. They struggle to distinguish between healthy religious communities and potentially dangerous groups. Many isolate themselves completely, finding loneliness preferable to the risk of being deceived again. The legal system often fails survivors in profound ways. Prosecutors frequently decline to pursue cases against cult leaders due to the complexity of proving psychological manipulation and the challenges of overcoming religious freedom defenses. Civil lawsuits can drag on for years, forcing survivors to relive their trauma repeatedly while battling well-funded legal teams. Many cases end in settlements that include non-disclosure agreements, preventing survivors from speaking publicly about their experiences. This legal protection of abusive groups creates a dangerous precedent. When the Tony Alamo Christian Ministries faced federal investigation, they hired expensive attorneys who argued that government interference violated their religious liberty. Similar tactics were used by the Remnant Fellowship and the Love family. The courts often bend over backward to avoid appearing to discriminate against religious practices, even when those practices clearly harm vulnerable people. The broader implications for society are troubling. These groups didn't operate in complete isolation. They had connections to mainstream religious organizations, business partnerships with legitimate companies, and relationships with local politicians. The network of enablers who looked the other way or actively supported these organizations reveals how deeply complicit our society can become in protecting abusers when they cloak themselves in religious language. Modern technology has created new challenges for both cult recruitment and survivor recovery. Social media platforms make it easier for manipulative groups to identify and target vulnerable individuals. Online forums and encrypted messaging allow these organizations to coordinate their activities and share tactics for avoiding detection. The same technology that could help survivors connect and heal is also being used to perpetuate abuse. The COVID-19 pandemic created ideal conditions for cult recruitment. Social isolation, economic uncertainty, and health fears made millions of people more susceptible to groups promising community, financial security, and protection from danger. Mental health professionals reported significant increases in cult-related inquiries during this period, suggesting that new groups were forming while existing ones were expanding their reach. Understanding the specific tactics these groups use reveals important patterns. Love bombing typically lasts just long enough to create emotional dependency, usually between 3 to 6 months. Information control follows predictable stages, beginning with discouraging outside reading and progressing to complete isolation from external sources. Financial exploitation often starts with small donations or volunteer work, gradually escalating to the surrender of all assets. The role of shame in maintaining control cannot be overstated. These groups systematically break down members' self-esteem, convincing them they are fundamentally flawed and unworthy of love outside the organization. Members are taught that their natural desires for autonomy, privacy, or outside relationships are sinful. This internalized shame makes it incredibly difficult to leave, as members genuinely believe they deserve the abuse they're receiving. Recovery requires specialized therapeutic approaches. Traditional counseling methods often prove inadequate for addressing the complex trauma of cult involvement. Survivors need therapists who understand the specific psychological mechanisms of undue influence and can help them distinguish between healthy religious or spiritual practices and manipulative control tactics. Support groups specifically for cult survivors provide crucial peer connections. Hearing from others who've had similar experiences helps break through the isolation and shame that keeps many survivors silent. These groups also serve as early warning systems, helping identify new organizations that might be using similar tactics. The children of cult survivors face unique challenges. Many struggle with intergenerational trauma, inheriting their parents' hypervigilance and difficulty trusting others. Some develop an intense aversion to any form of organized religion or spiritual practice. Others swing in the opposite direction, becoming vulnerable to other manipulative groups in their search for the sense of purpose and community they remember from childhood. Prevention efforts must focus on education rather than simply warning people about specific groups. Teaching critical thinking skills, helping people recognize manipulation tactics, and promoting healthy skepticism of anyone claiming exclusive access to truth or salvation provides better protection than trying to maintain lists of dangerous organizations. The stories of the Tony Alamo Christian Ministries, the Remnant Fellowship, and the Love Family remind us that evil often wears the mask of righteousness. These groups succeeded because they offered something genuine that people desperately needed: community, purpose, and hope. The tragedy is that they perverted these universal human needs into tools of exploitation and abuse. As we continue to grapple with questions of religious freedom, individual rights, and community safety, these cases provide crucial lessons. They show us that protecting religious liberty cannot mean turning a blind eye to obvious harm. They demonstrate that charismatic leadership without accountability inevitably leads to abuse. Most importantly, they remind us that our most sincere spiritual seeking can make us vulnerable to those who would exploit our deepest needs for their own twisted purposes. The survivors of these groups show remarkable courage in rebuilding their lives and speaking out about their experiences. Their voices serve as warnings to others and as beacons of hope for those still trapped in similar situations. What makes these cult leaders so devastatingly effective isn't just their religious manipulation or financial exploitation. It's something far more insidious. They understand that in the aftermath of trauma, when survivors try to rebuild their lives, the real battle has only just begun. The psychological scars left by these organizations create a perfect storm of vulnerability that can persist for decades, often passed down through generations like a terrible inheritance. The survivors of the Tony Alamo Christian Ministries, the Remnant Fellowship, and the Love Family don't simply walk away and return to normal life. They emerge carrying invisible wounds that reshape every aspect of their existence. Understanding these lasting effects isn't just academic curiosity. It's essential for recognizing how deeply these groups damage the human psyche and why recovery is such a monumental challenge. The first, and perhaps most devastating psychological impact, is what researchers call learned helplessness. Within these cult environments, members are systematically stripped of their ability to make independent decisions. Every choice, from what to eat to whom to marry, is dictated by the leadership. Over months and years, this creates a profound conditioning where individuals lose confidence in their own judgment. Sarah, who spent 12 years in the Love Family, describes the paralysis she felt after leaving. I stood in a grocery store for 2 hours trying to choose between different brands of cereal. I had panic attacks making simple decisions because I'd been trained that my choices were always wrong, always sinful, always selfish. This learned helplessness extends far beyond daily decisions. Survivors often struggle with career choices, relationships, and major life transitions. They've been conditioned to believe that independent thinking leads to spiritual damnation or community rejection. The result is a kind of decision paralysis that can persist for years after leaving the group. Even more profound is the complete identity dissolution that occurs within these organizations. Cult members aren't just asked to modify their behavior, they're required to completely abandon their previous sense of self. Names are changed, personal histories are rewritten, and individual preferences are labeled as manifestations of sinful pride. Former Remnant Fellowship member Michael explains this process. They didn't just want you to follow their rules, they wanted you to become someone else entirely. Your personality, your interests, your way of thinking, everything that made you unique was systematically dismantled. After 15 years, I didn't know who I was anymore. This identity erasure creates what psychologists term floating anxiety in survivors. Without a solid sense of self to anchor them, former members often experience persistent feelings of unreality and disconnection. They may feel like they're acting in a play, going through the motions of normal life, without any internal compass to guide them. The recovery process involves nothing less than reconstructing an entire identity from scratch. Many survivors describe feeling like children again, having to learn basic life skills and rediscover fundamental aspects of their personality. This reconstruction can take decades, and some never fully recover their sense of authentic selfhood. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of cult psychological damage is how it affects entire family lines. Children raised in these environments don't just experience the trauma directly. They inherit distorted worldviews, damaged attachment patterns, and dysfunctional relationship models that they unconsciously pass to their own children. Lisa, whose parents joined the Tony Alamo Christian Ministries when she was 3, describes the intergenerational impact. I never learned normal emotional regulation because my parents were constantly in crisis mode, waiting for the end times or dealing with some new persecution. I didn't know how to form healthy relationships because I'd only seen controlling, fear based interactions. Unlike single incident trauma, complex trauma results from prolonged exposure to multiple traumatic experiences during critical developmental periods. These children grow up with dysregulated nervous systems, difficulty trusting others, and profound confusion about what constitutes normal behavior. The spiritual dimension of cult trauma creates its own unique category of lasting damage. These organizations don't just exploit religious faith. Members are taught that questioning the group's teachings or leaving the organization will result in eternal damnation, not just for themselves, but for their families. This spiritual terrorism continues to haunt former members long after they've physically left the group. Many describe persistent nightmares about hellfire and divine punishment. Others experience panic attacks when entering traditional churches or engaging with religious materials. The very faith that once provided comfort becomes a source of terror. Rebecca, who escaped from the Love family after 8 years, explains, "They didn't just tell us we'd go to hell if we left. They convinced us that we'd be personally responsible for the damnation of our children and grandchildren." Even now, 15 years later, I sometimes wake up in a cold sweat, worrying that I've doomed my family by leaving. This spiritual trauma often prevents survivors from accessing traditional sources of meaning and community. Many remain permanently alienated from organized religion, losing not just their specific faith, but their ability to find spiritual connection anywhere. Others swing to the opposite extreme, becoming obsessively religious in an attempt to prove their spiritual worthiness. The financial devastation caused by these groups creates its own psychological aftermath. Members who gave everything to these organizations often emerge not just financially ruined, but with no practical skills for economic survival. Having spent years or decades in environments where money was considered evil, or where all financial decisions were made by leadership, they lack basic financial literacy. The psychological impact of this economic vulnerability cannot be overstated. Many survivors remain trapped in poverty, unable to rebuild their lives or provide for their families. This economic instability reinforces feelings of helplessness and inadequacy, creating a cycle where financial stress compounds psychological trauma. The legal system's failure to adequately address cult abuse creates another layer of psychological damage. Survivors seeking justice often find that their experiences don't fit neatly into existing legal categories. Psychological manipulation, spiritual abuse, and systematic exploitation are difficult to prosecute, leaving many victims without legal recourse. This legal abandonment sends a clear message to survivors that their suffering doesn't matter, that the harm done to them isn't recognized by society. Many describe feeling victimized twice, first by the cult and then by a legal system that seems designed to protect the very organizations that destroyed their lives. The social stigma surrounding cult involvement creates additional barriers to recovery. Survivors often face judgment from friends, family, and community members who can't understand how intelligent people could fall for such obvious manipulation. This social rejection compounds the isolation already created by years of cult involvement. Many survivors report losing not just their cult community when they leave, but their entire social network. Family members still in the group are required to shun them. Friends from before their cult involvement have moved on. The result is profound social isolation at precisely the moment when human connection is most needed for healing. The therapeutic challenges faced by cult survivors are immense. Traditional therapy models often prove inadequate for addressing the complex combination of trauma, identity loss, spiritual abuse, and social isolation that characterizes cult damage. Many therapists lack training in cult-specific issues, sometimes inadvertently causing additional harm by minimizing the survivor's experiences or failing to understand the unique dynamics of cult manipulation. Specialized cult recovery programs exist, but are often expensive and geographically limited. Many survivors cannot access the specific help they need, instead cycling through various therapeutic approaches that provide limited relief. The healing process is further complicated by the fact that cult trauma affects every aspect of a person's life simultaneously, requiring comprehensive treatment that addresses psychological, spiritual, social, and practical needs. Despite these overwhelming challenges, recovery is possible. Survivors who receive appropriate support can rebuild their lives, develop healthy relationships, and find meaning beyond their cult experiences. However, this recovery process is typically measured in decades rather than years, and it requires specialized understanding and support. The most effective recovery programs recognize that cult survivors aren't simply trauma victims. They're individuals whose entire reality has been systematically distorted and who must essentially learn to live in the world for the first time. This requires not just healing from trauma, but developing basic life skills, rebuilding identity, and learning to trust their own judgment. Support groups specifically for cult survivors have proven particularly valuable. These groups provide the unique understanding that comes from shared experience while offering practical guidance for navigating the challenges of post-cult life. Members learn that their struggles are normal responses to abnormal situations and that recovery, while difficult, is achievable. The lasting psychological effects of cult involvement serve as a stark reminder of the human cost of these organizations. They reveal how groups like the Tony Alamo Christian Ministries, the Remnant Fellowship, and the Love Family don't just exploit their members temporarily. They create wounds that can last lifetimes and affect multiple generations. Understanding these lasting effects is crucial, not just for helping survivors heal, but for preventing future exploitation. These psychological scars represent the true legacy of cult abuse, a hidden epidemic of human suffering that continues long after the headlines fade and the legal cases close. They remind us that the fight against cult manipulation isn't just about shutting down dangerous organizations. The scope of damage these cults inflicted extends far beyond their immediate victims. We're talking about generational trauma that continues to ripple through families and communities decades after these groups were exposed. Children who grew up in these environments often struggle with basic life skills that most of us take for granted. They don't know how to make simple decisions without seeking permission from an authority figure. They can't form healthy relationships because they've never seen what genuine love looks like without conditions and control attached. The financial devastation is equally staggering. Survivors frequently emerge with nothing, having turned over their life savings, inheritance, and property to these organizations. They have no credit history, no retirement savings, no assets to fall back on. Many have gaps in their employment history that are difficult to explain to potential employers. They're starting over from scratch at ages when most people are thinking about retirement, trying to rebuild lives that were systematically dismantled by people they trusted with their souls. What makes recovery even more challenging is the way these groups deliberately damaged their members' ability to think critically. Former members describe feeling like they have to relearn how to make decisions, how to trust their own judgment, how to distinguish between healthy and unhealthy relationships. The programming runs so deep that even years after leaving, survivors catch themselves asking permission for things they have every right to do as adults. The medical neglect that occurred in these groups has left many survivors with chronic health conditions that could have been prevented with proper care. In the Remnant Fellowship, members were encouraged to ignore medical advice and trust in divine healing. The Tony Alamo Christian Ministries discouraged members from seeking mental health treatment, viewing depression and anxiety as spiritual failings rather than medical conditions requiring professional care. The Love Family's drug use and poor living conditions created health problems that persist decades later. Perhaps most heartbreaking is how these groups poisoned the concept of spirituality and community for their victims. Many survivors describe feeling spiritually homeless, unable to participate in religious activities that once brought them comfort because they trigger memories of manipulation and abuse. They struggle to trust religious leaders or even to pray because these normal spiritual practices became weapons of control in the hands of their abusers. The isolation these groups created was so complete that many survivors emerged without basic social skills. They don't know how to make friends, how to participate in normal social activities, or how to navigate relationships that aren't based on hierarchy and control. Simple things like going to a movie, choosing what to eat at a restaurant, or deciding how to spend a free afternoon become overwhelming when you've never been allowed to make such choices for yourself. The legal system's response to these groups has been frustratingly inadequate. While some leaders like Tony Alamo were eventually prosecuted, the justice system struggles to address the full scope of the damage these organizations cause. Financial crimes are easier to prosecute than psychological manipulation. Physical abuse leaves evidence that emotional abuse often doesn't. The result is that many of these groups operated for decades with minimal legal interference, destroying countless lives while hiding behind religious freedom protections. Law enforcement agencies have had to develop new strategies for investigating these groups. Traditional investigative techniques often fail when dealing with members who have been conditioned to lie to outsiders who genuinely believe they're protecting their spiritual family by refusing to cooperate with authorities. Building trust with potential witnesses requires specialized training and approaches that many law enforcement agencies are still developing. The internet age has created new challenges and opportunities in dealing with cult-like groups. On one hand, information about these organizations is more readily available than ever before. Former members can share their stories through blogs, social media, and online support groups, creating networks of survivors who can help each other heal. Families can research groups their loved ones have joined, looking for warning signs and connecting with others in similar situations. But the internet has also made it easier for these groups to recruit new members and spread their message. They can create polished websites and social media presences that hide their true nature behind carefully crafted marketing. They can target vulnerable individuals with precision advertising, reaching people at their lowest moments when they're most susceptible to manipulation. The psychological techniques these groups use are becoming more sophisticated as our understanding of human psychology advances. Modern cult leaders study the same social psychology research that legitimate therapists and educators use, but they apply this knowledge to exploit rather than heal. They understand how to trigger attachment responses, how to create artificial intimacy, how to make people feel special and chosen while simultaneously breaking down their sense of self. Educational institutions are beginning to recognize the need to teach people about these manipulation techniques. Some schools now include units on recognizing and resisting psychological manipulation as part of their health or social studies curricula. Universities are training counselors and social workers to recognize the signs of cult involvement and to work effectively with survivors. The role of family members in both prevention and recovery cannot be overstated. Families who maintain loving, non-judgmental contact with members of these groups often provide the lifeline that eventually enables their loved ones to leave. But this requires incredible patience and emotional strength as families watch their relatives become increasingly isolated and controlled while feeling powerless to help. Support groups for families of cult members have become crucial resources, providing strategies for maintaining contact, recognizing warning signs of escalating abuse, and preparing for the possibility that their loved one may eventually seek help. These groups also provide emotional support for family members who often blame themselves for not recognizing the danger sooner or for not being able to prevent their loved one from joining. The stories of the Tony Alamo Christian Ministries, the Remnant Fellowship, and the Love Family serve as stark reminders that the human need for belonging, purpose, and transcendence can be weaponized by those who understand how to exploit our deepest vulnerabilities. These groups succeeded not because their victims were weak or stupid, but because they offered something that everyone needs: a sense of community, meaning, and spiritual connection. The tragedy is that legitimate religious and spiritual communities exist that can provide these same benefits without the manipulation, abuse, and control. The challenge for society is learning to distinguish between healthy spiritual communities and dangerous cults, and developing the tools to protect vulnerable individuals from those who would exploit their search for meaning. As we conclude this examination of these three deadly cults, we must remember that their victims deserve our compassion, not our judgment. They were seeking something beautiful and necessary, something that makes us fundamentally human. The fact that predators were able to twist these natural desires into instruments of control and abuse is a tragedy that affects us all. The best protection against these groups is education, awareness, and the cultivation of healthy communities where people can find genuine belonging without surrendering their autonomy or dignity. By understanding how these groups operated, by listening to survivors' stories, and by supporting efforts to help those who have been harmed, we can work to ensure that fewer people fall victim to those who would exploit our most fundamental human needs for their own twisted purposes. The fight against dangerous cults is ultimately a fight for human dignity, for the right of every person to seek meaning and community without being exploited or abused. It's a fight worth having, and one that requires all of us to remain vigilant, compassionate, and committed to protecting the vulnerable members of our society.